No. So our next speaker is Paul, and Paul is, he's spoken up here a few times now. He's with the Forest Service Enterprise Program in their Washington, D.C. office. And I'll let him talk about his major area of study in finding things that didn't work. He's designed and implemented stream restoration projects now for 25 years. A fish biologist with a passion for fine sediments. And he's got a couple pictures here. With the bottom picture also includes Johan. All right, so Paul, I will go ahead and make you the presenter so you can share your screen. And we'll hear a little bit about the Wayback Machine. You should have had a little pop-up window that pops up.
Thank you, Jean. I'm just trying to make sure I've got the correct one displayed here. Let me try to start the presentation, see if I've got the right one selected.
Okay, we see your desktop right there.
Okay, so
there we go.
I've got a little lag. Okay, perfect. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking on and joining us here. You've heard some really excellent presentations on population dynamics and the level of uplift and effort that's needed for a dramatic response as far as fish go. Johan talked about our history and our evolution, and you got to see some great examples. So what I want to do in this presentation is just kind of create draw some linkages from what you've seen in Oregon and Washington and translate how those might look on a landscape that you're familiar with. And so the first thing I want to do is Donald McKenzie. So the same guy that Kate's River is named after, he was part of the Astoria Overland Party that followed Lewis and Clark out to the mouth of the Columbia River. And an interesting little tidbit I found while I was just searching Google. Turns out he spent a good part of 1818 and then again in 1822 with his party on the Pahsimeroi River. And it said they were trapping the abundant fur-bearing mammals present. So that's kind of indicative of what this place might have been. And then also one other thing, several years ago, Kate told me that if she could only have one superpower, because as you can tell, she does have multiple, she said if she was limited to one, she would want that one superpower to be time travel, so she could see these valleys in their former grandeur. So in this presentation, what we're going to do is do a little time travel together and see what things might have looked like here on the Pahsimeroi pre-contact. And so for the locator map, borrowed Tim Copeland's image from his paper, so this does a really good job. Pretty self-explanatory. I think most folks are familiar with the Pahsimeroi, tributary to the Salmon River there in Idaho. But before we jump into kind of the restoration, you know, what Johan was sharing with you in our history is that when we were designing a lot of those early projects that he shared with you, we were really driven by what we called reference conditions, and pattern, profile, and dimension. Those dominated our field of vision. We'd find a place that we thought was functioning correctly, we monitored or surveyed the heck out of it, and then replicated it in our new designs. So Johan showed you kind of how our thinking changed over time when we weren't seeing the responses that we had expected. So I'm going to just show you kind of how some of those changes reflect the way we look at a valley like this one now. But before we kind of jump in and talk about the river itself, I think it's important to kind of set the context and look at landscape scale drivers that are influencing the fluvial process spaces within the Pahsimeroi River. So I think we'll do that first. I'll be super brief, but I think it's important to touch on some of this stuff. We do have LiDAR coverage, like Brian mentioned. We use this quite a bit in our analysis, and I'll show you how in just a moment. But this is the extent of LiDAR coverage we have for the Pahsimeroi. So as far as those external influences, I'm highlighting some of the tributary fans coming into the valley here. And as I turn these on, you can see varying degrees of influence to the valley. And flow is from the bottom right to the upper left. And so you can see above that place I have labeled as Hooper Lane, those confluence fans very much are constricting the process space that's available there. And then we can see varying degrees as we look further down valley. So someone mentioned in the chat about the geomorphic control being absolutely critical to these projects and this restoration approach. And that is absolutely true. There is nothing more important than that as far as establishing a new base control. The geomorphic control is going to dictate everything that's going to happen headward of there. So that's an absolute must. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So I'm zooming into that neighborhood just above Hooper Lane. And in the next image, I'm going to rotate this into the oblique view, just so you can kind of see how much those confluence fans, you know, the low angle one coming off from the east, but then more importantly, probably this one coming in off the west, it's absolutely burying most of the Pahsimeroi Valley there. And so Johan mentioned, you know, we get that stair stepping of different valley types as we look through kind of the Miller diagram. And so upstream of this confluence fan, you can see that we have a depositional valley, and then these two fans pinch, they allow no more process space for anything other than a basic channel between them. And then we can pick up a depositional valley again downstream of that. So with that quick landscape look, just wanted to set the stage for kind of, you know, what the process spaces are and what's limiting them as we jump into the river. So usually when we show up on a site, folks want to just walk straight out to the river and jump in and show me an eroding bank and say, how are we going to fix this? So figure we kind of walk through that together and what that really looks like. So this is the hillshade LiDAR for a segment right at the hatchery, for folks that know where that is. So, you know, you see the questions there. What is river restoration? What are the conditions that we're going to be restoring? Are we going to restore individual habitats, natural processes, process-based restoration, right? What's important to us, and how do we know, and how do we select and move forward with some of this stuff? So if I turn on the aerial image, what's our first impressions of this site? So when I look at it, what I'm seeing, if I was in Brian's plane flying over the top of this, I'll say, well, I'm seeing sinuous channels, probably has pools, riffles, glides, all those good habitats. I see what I assume is willows. It's got a floodplain. I don't see log jams or beaver dams, you know, so we're kind of missing some of that in-channel roughness elements. But all in all, this looks pretty nice. It could probably use some complexity, you know, from some woody elements, but, you know, you've heard my friends mention this before. This is kind of looking at this particular piece of ground with our channel goggles on. So with our channel goggles, we're really looking at habitat from the perspective of individual units, or at best, probably a reach scale. Is there another way we could look at this? And you've heard them mention valley goggles before. And what's cool about valley goggles, first, they look way cooler. They got that cool mirrored lens, and you can see the landscape reflected in them. So that's a bonus in itself. But what they do is they allow us to kind of see these fluvial processes and how surfaces relate to one another. And so I know this is a terrible image from GIS, but I just wanted to show you, you know, the detail is not important. Just I wanted to show you how we're looking at the valley as a whole, not just that particular reach. And so what I'm going to do in GIS is draw a valley center line, and I'm not following any particular channel. It's literally just right down the center of the valley, the fall line, and we're going to plot that up in Excel. And so that's what this looks like when I plot the bare earth centerline elevations. And so you can see it's kind of bumpy and such. And one of the first questions that always gets asked when we start talking about stage 0 restoration, and it came up in the chat today, is what's your valley slope? And so a couple points I wanted to make on valley slope. First, they're very, very rarely, if ever, linear. So I put a linear slope on this diagram just so you can see what a linear line looks like. And it agrees with two places in this basically 16-mile long valley. So valley slope is not one thing, it's multiple things. And so most of them kind of have this catena shape to them. And so knowing this shape of the valley is really what's important. So what we're going to do is we're going to detrend this profile with a polynomial equation. So now we can see the detrended line, and this particular valley, this math equation that I'm showing on the screen is describing this valley with an R-squared that's pretty decent. I'm going to say that's a good fit right there. And so knowing this, that kind of gives us a datum to compare against. So in GIS, what I'm going to do in the next couple slides, and I'm not going to walk you through the mechanics of doing it, but basically what this is going to give us for this full 29 kilometers of valley, that's all depositional, it's all the same valley. It's got compression and expansion zones, but I'm going to generate an elevation, a datum, every meter down this entire extent, and then also generate valley spanning cross sections at those same 1 meter intervals. So that's going to allow me to compare all elevations within the valley against this profile. And so as we jump into here, this is kind of where that hatchery reach sits, just so we have some context. So we'll zoom into that little neighborhood. And this is kind of what it looks like. So again, you can see I'm crossing high spots and low spots with my center line. But again, the green line is that detrended valley profile. And you can kind of see how it's skimming across the top of what most folks would call top of bank or floodplain, things like that. So in the next slide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that aerial image back on, and I'm going to show you everything within the valley that's an exact match for that green line, for our geomorphic grade line. And so when we do that, what do we see? Some of the channels upstream of the hatchery are beautifully highlighted by these markers. And so it's what it's doing is it's painting those relic flow paths on the valley floor that are a perfect match for that geomorphic grade line. So similarly, if we kind of look over here on this kind of southwest border of the valley, we can see some of those channels are highlighted perfectly. But if we look up in here where the majority of our water is, this is an absolute terrible match. And so the first thing that comes to mind is, well, why? Why is it not capturing any of these channels? It's a little disappointing, right? We'd expect the GGL, if it's as good as what we've been told, it should be highlighting these flow paths. So does that mean our GGL is wrong? Is there something I've missed there, or do I need to look at things differently? So before we put on these valley goggles, I got to explain to you how they work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more colors to the spectrum. We're going to broaden our spectrum a little and add more relative elevations. So rather than just absolute zeros, we're going to add in all of these breaks. And so these values are in decimeters. So for folks that aren't good at quick conversions of decimeters to inches, 1 decimeter is just shy of 4 inches. Now, since riverbeds are hardly ever plain flat, right? This is just my starting point for a place I haven't visited personally. I'm going to bracket -2 decimeters to 0. Anything kind of in that neighborhood, I'm going to call that my shallow riverbed elevation. As we move further down the spectrum, kind of the darker blue areas, those are spots that are up to a ½ meter below target elevation. That generally represents our deeper pool type areas. As we get into the light pink, those can be tricky. That can highlight former beaver ponds like you see there in the image. It can also show us where we're starting to get into incision problems. And then as we turn on the darker pinks, we're absolutely getting into channelization and incision and some of those degraded streams that I'm sure everybody on the call is familiar with. On the positive end of the spectrum, if I look at things that are at 0 and just above to maybe that positive +2, that's kind of that perennially inundated emergent wetland kind of vegetation zone. So the photo right there kind of shows you what you might expect to see in that zone. The dark green is going to be our willows and shrubs, things of that nature. Dark green and yellow and even the light green, as you can see here in this photo, that's where we're going to start picking up our riparian trees. So maybe our cottonwoods, maple, spruce, tamarack, cedar, wetland type trees that can handle being quite wet and it's not going to flood them out and drown them. The conifers, like Brian will show you in the photos, will not tolerate being this wet, and it's going to cause them to die out. And so now if we go back to the hatchery, I can add those surfaces, not just the absolute zeros, but that 0 to -5. And so, my light blue showing our shallow bed elevations, and then the dark blue showing our deeper kind of pool type of areas. And so that's painting up a lot more of the surfaces in here. If I add in the light pinks to show what, might be former beaver pond areas, well, that's picking up almost everything within this valley. If I turn all that off and let's look at the dark pinks, the incision, what's that coloring up? Now that's grabbing pretty much where all of our base flow channels sit. And so you can see how it's kind of matching channelization with the current flow paths that we see on the landscape. And if I keep going up on the positive end, where we'd see our emergent vegetation and our different riparian communities, kind of where we'd expect to see those things falling out, getting higher up into our transition vegetation, and then finally into our upland vegetation is going to be up in here. And so if we bring that all together, what does this show us about the current conditions? Does this change the way we thought about those channels and the willows and things that we saw when I first asked you about this spot and I showed you the aerial image? What this is telling me is that the channels that we see currently flowing through here and that we thought looked pretty decent, what those actually are is that's head cuts and incision running up through the bed of former wetlands and beaver ponds. So if you can remember what Donald McKenzie was doing here in 1818 and 1822, he was trapping beaver, right? So with the REM, I can color everything that I'd expect to be standing water or surface water at base flow conditions in this blue. And then the warmer colors show me what vegetation I would expect to see around that area. So it puts this whole thing into a different kind of context. So what would this look like in your Idaho landscape? Well, Brian had this gorgeous image of an actual factual live beaver pond wetland meadow, which just so happens to be Marsh Creek, which is further up the Salmon River drainage. So this is exactly what mental image comes to mind for me on that same hatchery reach that we were just looking at. So in addition to this, we had a lot of questions about fish use and such. So I borrowed another piece of information out of the Copeland paper. And so on the left of this graphic, what we have, oops, sorry, trying to get my pointer. We've got pre-restoration and post-restoration smolts per female. So these are for Chinook. And this is pretty phenomenal. And absolute hats off to Tim and Wendy and the rest of the crew, going from 50 smolts per female to doubling that, over 100. That is phenomenal. I think anyone would be super proud of that. But on top of that, is that the ceiling? Is that the maximum we can do? If we look at the rest of this graph, sorry, I just realized I think I had stuff in you guys' way. If we look at Marsh Creek, where this photo was taken from, look at our smolts per female in this neighborhood. We're talking 6-7 times higher than the Pahsimeroi was in the pre-project condition. So that's a tremendous uplift in fish production. And earlier, also, I wanted to hit on one of the questions I was asked in the chat. Someone asked a question about stranding. And I wanted to touch on it while we have this picture up, because it's not a simple yes or no answer to that. Stranding is kind of like fine sediment or any of the other parameters we've talked about. And in a single thread channel network where fish can be stranded in isolated areas, that's a adverse impact on the fish, right? But the actual answer for these kind of complex habitats is a lot more complex as well. So yes, fish can become isolated and detached from surface flow in some of these areas. And yes, some of those fish will die, but it can also be a benefit to those fish. That is an escape mechanism for a lot of these fish to avoid predation and stuff. And so, an isolated body of water in a single thread channel might be stagnant, warm, have low DO, and the fish might perish in there. versus in this kind of landscape, the alluvial aquifer, the shallow groundwater, is at the same GGL elevation. So the thing's being kept cold, it's being sub-irrigated, it's got oxygen, and fish actually rear quite well in those environments. So the fish stranding thing is a difficult one, and I just kind of wanted to differentiate why it's different in this landscape. So anyway, take home for this whole thing is that I think we, talking about disturbances, fire, floods, all these different things, I think we often conflate disturbance with human-caused degradation. So disturbances, a landscape like what we see here, can absolutely absorb those and even benefit from them. It's an increased, delivery of sediments or wood or nutrients, all that kind of stuff. The human-caused disturbance that we're seeing on these rivers is different, though. It's crossed us over a threshold, and Brian used the word state change earlier, and that's absolutely what's happened. We've fundamentally changed the way this river functions and processes. So I think those are important points to make. So enough on that. Is all of this just smoke and mirrors? Well, if we were in class in person together and we would go to the field and we would actually look at these. We build these REMs, we put them on our phones or your tablet, GPS, however you like to go to the field. And your little yellow dot there is going to show you exactly where you're at. So we can go explore and validate sites and make adjustments, as Kate mentioned. Since we can't do that in person this year, hopefully someday we will, we're going to have to explore this landscape virtually. So let's start up at the top and we'll work our way down again. But even at this zoomed out scale, we can see that there's a lot of variability on this landscape when I use my REM. We have compressed areas between fans right here where we're only going to get a single thread channel. We have broad unconfined segments. Oops, sorry about that. Broad unconfined segments in here. And then again, we have constricted zones. So all of those things are going to function slightly differently. So if we turn on just kind of this look and show what our wetted environment would be at base flow using REM, we can see at the upper left there, we would have two codominant channels enter from the lower right, and those are converging into a single thread channel for a bit, and then it goes to codominant channels again. And then below there, what we see is we would have an enormous, very huge wetland complex immediately downstream. So this would just be a phenomenal rearing opportunity for fish. So, oops, my animation's not quite right there. So you can see where we'd expect to see the different riparian vegetations. But also in that upper extent where we're confined between those two confluence fans, that's where we're going to see our larger substrate sizes, less erodible. That's going to be our spawning hotspot. Not only that, we're going to get a lot of upwelling water from the way the fan's causing the valley upstream to sub through portions of it. So we can see we're going to have springbrook heads on that far right. So just think about fish that would be spawned in an environment like that on the lower right. Those alvin come up out of the gravels, drift down into this rearing, just absolute nursery below. So these kind of things, when you put it all together and the connectivity between these habitat units is how we can really grow nice fish. If we keep making our way downstream, I just want to show you something that's kind of cool, and it's in pretty much every one of these valleys we look at. And so kind of mid-valley, you see that super broad neighborhood. Again, it would be a very big, large beaver pond wetland complex. But I'm going to look at two spots in the next slides. First one is this spot I'm looking at here, and then this one right here. So kind of a broad unconfined segment, and then we'll look at a confined segment and just look at the differences and look at the habitats within them. So what I'm doing here is just drawing a cross section across the valley from left to right, and that's what's profiled up in here. And so what I wanted to show folks is that target elevation doesn't mean you're filling everything to target elevation, or to the zero, I should say. And so my interpretation of this landscape is that this whole surface would be a big beaver pond wetland and about 1 meter deep. So you can see the bed of this should be about, so -10 is -10 decimeters, about 1 meter. That's about where the bed should be, and then we should have some standing water above of the target elevations. But instead, these channel networks, like we saw at the hatchery, think about if you've ever tried to walk across a beaver pond, what the substrates are, that muck that you sink into, extremely highly erodible. And you can see these channels have really easily knifed through that stuff. And so this particular one right here, we're 2.5 meters below the target elevation, the zero elevation. So we're going to go down to that constricted area and look at what happens on that if we do the same thing, put a cross section on there. Oh, and actually stage 0 restoration would be to simply fill in those incised channels here. So now we're sliding downriver to that constriction between those two fans. And this is going to be a constricted area. That's what process space is available here. And so you can see again, I've got my 0 elevation marked here. Way, way, way smaller valley width. What, we're maybe 200 meters wide, something like that in here. But look at the depth of incision. We're only at 1 meter here. And again, that's going to be because the materials we'd expect to see underneath this, as a result of those two confluence fans coming together, it's going to be coarser substrates, less erodible, and again, where we would expect to find those spawning hotspots. And just keep running down the valley, you're going to see the same kind of themes repeating. Broad, unconfined beaver pond segments, so the most incision versus confined areas, which is kind of backwards though of what you would think. You know, you think a broad area would be less erosive, but that's not the case. So the geomorphic control for the Pahsimeroi River is the confluence with the Salmon River. And so you'll notice that on the colors here, the two match. The elevation of the salmon is the same as the elevation of the Pahsimeroi right there. And that's because the salmon is controlling everything that happens upstream in the Pahsimeroi Valley. So that was a really quick walk down, and I gave you my interpretation of the current surfaces versus stage 0. So now the question becomes, so what? In the current conditions, we have multiple channels, and we learned that that's good, right? We have decent riparian vegetation. What are we missing? What would stage 0 provide that we don't have now? And this is going to be really crude, at least on the current conditions. But what I've done is I've just gone through and made polygons to map out what you currently have wetted. And as you'll see in this next slide, I've overestimated how much is actually wetted at base flow conditions. But let's just say it's everything there in the blue. This whole, whatever it was, 29-kilometer valley would have 740 acres of perennially wetted habitats, which is not bad. But what would 0 give us? 0 would give us 4,700 acres of perennially wetted habitats, which is a tremendous uplift. And probably more important than just the amount, but what it is. So it's those habitats that Tim told us this morning we've lost. You know, we still have single thread transport pieces of channel. That's not what we've lost. Our big losses in these valleys has been the backwater habitats, the beaver ponds, the sloughs, those really low velocity rearing habitats. And that's what we would get back in spades. And just like Jacob Katz showed us down in the Sacramento Valley, we grow a phenomenal amount of food on those kind of surfaces. And like Brian showed us in his exercise, not only would fish have access to those, but it's every day. It's not for 3 hours during a bankful discharge, it's every day. And you combine those two things together, that's where you're growing your big, healthy Chinook parr like Kate was showing us from the South Fork project. So one more thing I wanted to borrow from the Tim Copeland paper, and I was just looking at parr densities on the landscape. And I thought, okay, I don't know that this is the mean, but just visually, 15 fish per 100 square meters looked like kind of a mean between all those sites. So I said, what if we applied that density of fish to our current wetted habitats? We'd have 2.9 million square meters. So the combination of those is going to give us 435,000 parr produced out of the Pahsimeroi. At those same densities, which is probably very low, 19 million acres gives us 2.85 million parr. And so again, salmon are very much a pyramid scheme kind of thing. The bigger the base we have, we can lose a few fish. We talked about stranding. Yes, a few fish are going to get stranded and die. Some are going to get eaten. But when we have that much broader of a base, herons and bears and everybody else has to eat too. So there's more of everything and it goes around. Also borrowing this from Tim's presentation, and again, those backwater habitats, the kind of stuff that we would just have a tremendous amount of in this valley. And again, look at our fish densities that we could have in there. So the combination of those things, we could have a much, much, much more productive environment. So everything I've shared with you guys so far is kind of related to stage 0. It's like, if we could go back to pre-disturbance days, pre-degradation days to the stage 0 condition, what might this valley look like? But what if you can't go back to the future? I know we have, roads across the valley I could see. I'm sure there's different land ownerships and such. So maybe going back to 0 right now is not feasible. That doesn't mean it's a dead end. We can still go, we can turn the dial to the right and progress to stage 8. And Kate shared a little bit with us what stage 8 is. And so if I go back to our valley profile that we looked at, we talked about how the Salmon River is the geomorphic control for the Pahsimeroi. And now when we looked at that image of the salmon, we could see it's not at its former elevation either. It has also incised. And so our base control has dropped, which results in a head cut running up through the valley. And that's exactly what we've seen, right? And just like Johan shared with you, when we were doing our work early in the days, the head cutting had already occurred. The next step in evolution is to start to go lateral and try to create that new surface. And that's what we were inhibiting from happening. So hopefully we've learned our lessons and we're not doing that anymore. And I just wanted to show you that same landscape. If we lower this whole thing by 0.7 meters, which is not very much, it's a very, very small amount compared to some of the projects we saw earlier. What does this look like for the Pahsimeroi? So we're back up in here in this upper piece. And so you can see we're not wetting to the same extent that we did in the stage 0, but stage 8 is still pretty phenomenal. And this gives us that state change back to a depositional or response environment. And we're still going to have high quality spawning, adjacent wetland ponds and such, all that connectivity between the different habitats. So it can be still quite valuable and grow these fish that we like to see. I'm having a hard time telling if I'm advancing too fast above what I'm speaking about, but hopefully, is anyone seeing like an English countryside right now?
Yes, sir, we see that.
Yep.
That kind of bums me out, to be honest. Can you guys all do me a favor and put on your valley goggles and take a look again? Because this is that same site 1 year later. And so again, just a change of perspective. This was the very first project built in England, deliberately creating a stage 0 condition after, probably 2,000 years worth of grazing. So they had a way bigger head start on degrading some of these valleys than we did. And it's still possible over there. And with that, I am going to wrap things up. Those are my take homes. Really do try to swap out the channel goggles and look at it from the fluvial process space of the valleys and recognize the nuance and the differences within those different valley types and what those might provide. And finally, if you can't go to stage 0, which you can't always go there, there's sometimes limiting factors. If that's the case, stage 8 can still be of tremendous value. So I will stop there. Thank you.
That was great, Paul. Thank you. So we do have time for questions, and maybe we could even get into some of those other questions, discussions that came up before lunch that we didn't quite have so much time for. One of the more immediate questions here is, do you have an estimate of how much of that 4,000 acres of habitat inundated at stage 0 is currently developed farmland in the Pahsimeroi Basin? I'm assuming Colton's referring to the Pahsimeroi Basin.
Yeah, I've not looked at that, but it wouldn't be too difficult. I imagine I could pull up the aerial images and draw some polygons pretty quickly.
So no, Colton, he hasn't looked too far into this. We just first approached him about this workshop in late December, right before Christmas, and he volunteered to do a little analysis on an Idaho stream. So we gave him the Pahsimeroi, and he's kind of just been putting the data together all in as part of this workshop. So, but as I mentioned, that could be done as a next stage. Are there any other questions? Or else, I was wondering too, Paul, if we could go back and maybe discuss some of the fish migration and how quickly, when you complete one of these Stage 0 restorations, if you could talk a little bit about the entrainment and the habitat that I think in your, let's see, one of your comments you've mentioned. Right, talking about the rearing and spawning habitat and how quickly the fish are coming back and able to utilize the habitat and fish migration. Yeah,
I also wanted to mention also that, you know, being virtual this time, we can't go to the field and look at the Pahsimeroi together, which is a bummer, but I think I did send those REMs. So if anyone does want to, you know, on your own time, upload it on your phone, take it to the field and see what you see. It's a pretty neat way to walk the ground sometimes, and a lot of things come into focus that you might not have recognized. And then back to, sorry, repeat the second part of your question, Jean. I already forgot what you asked.
There were some earlier questions before lunch, before the lunch break, talking about the fish, the immediate fish response, and if there was entrainment or pooling when you open up these new channels and it immediately your groundwater level restores, but what happens to the fish immediately following some of these project implementation? And I'll go back
good
to
question. So some of those early ones that Johan showed you were super small systems, and you know, we salvaged the fish and such, and those, we weren't too stressed about that. Fish came in immediately, like literally next day you come back on the site and there's fish on it. When we did our first kind of larger size one, that white juice one that they both shared with you, we were bringing that up 11 feet, and it, oh, what did we do? It was a little over a mile's worth of valley length. And I was a little stressed about it. I was like, well, what if, you know, what if it takes a while to charge this Saluda aquifer and we don't get flow coming out the backside? If, you know, if we're doing a summer base flow during our in-stream work window. So that stressed me out a little bit. So I said, why don't we do this activation? Oh, what did we do? I think it was February, when we knew we'd have a lot more water in the system. And so then we plugged it up, and instantly the thing just came to life. And then as we had the piezometers and things like that, we could see how rapidly that occurs. So we haven't had to do that in any project since. We simply do it at base flow, and that aquifer does charge quite quickly, and fish do move back onto the site almost instantaneously. Now, that being said, though, we do get a lot of pushback from, you know, some of the state fish and wildlife bios there. They'll say, you know, the habitat's not developed yet. When will this have fish habitat? And it doesn't have that classic pool, riffle, glide kind of sequences or anything like that developed yet, unless it's relic channels that it's reoccupying. So some of those things do take time, and the development of those is kind of backwards again to what most people expect. People expect channels to etch into the fill and kind of be created that way, versus what really happens is we need an event that brings in sediment, and these are depositional driven. The deposits get laid down, and then the plants instantly colonize that stuff, and then that's how it starts to build definition or boundaries around things. So everything about it is backwards. Okay, Johan, anything you guys want to add?
Or Brittany, does that address your earlier question on how do you maintain fish passage? I think it was you that, Brittany Moreland, that had asked that. I wanted to make sure we got that answered.
I can mention a little more on fish passage. So that's a bit of a mixed bag as well. Like Kate and Johan touched on, our mean depth actually goes up. So in most instances, we don't lose fish passage. However, there are a couple instances like the 5 Mile Bell project that Johan shared with you guys, it has a bunch of small tributaries coming into it, and they all have a tributary fan that were used for logging, and they cut a ditch through each of them. And so that ditch provides perennial passage every day of the year. It allowed fish to migrate above the confluence fans to the stream above. And so when we redid those, we said we want to regrade and recreate these confluence fans as well, which could result in loss of passage for adults at super low flow periods of time. And the fish agencies were okay with that. They were like, yeah, these fish move during freshets, they don't have to have access across that fan every single day in August because they're not there in August. So we do have some variances and such, I should mention as well. So probably just added more confusion.
No, I think that's helpful. There was another question. Can you talk about the spawning gravel availability after a restoration project like this?
Yeah, the spawning gravel is off the charts. Kate showed you some of the stuff off of Deer Creek and South Fork. That phase 1 of South Fork, I'm probably killing the stats here, but I believe there was 2 Chinook Reds in something like a 30 or 60 year period. While we were still demobbing the machinery from that phase 1, we had, what do we have, like 14 Chinook Reds on it instantly. And beavers were falling trees in the background. The place was coming alive instantly. When we built the phase 2, the numbers spiked. I forget exactly, but something like 241 Chinook Reds. So again, we're not creating new fish yet. Those fish would have gone somewhere else to spawn, but they did seek out this neighborhood and spawn on it. There's no shortage of spawning opportunities.
Chris, go ahead. You said you've got a question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Paul, this is Christopher Chuhajian with the Bureau of Reclamation. I'm working up here with some folks from Fish and Game, and so this is really interesting and quite helpful, and appreciate you doing all this background work for me. It's pretty awesome. So thanks ahead of time for that. I think that you really nailed it. You said that there's a lot of willow down on the valley bottom in this case. And that brings me to a question. You had, or actually maybe it was someone else had mentioned that the reason for putting in a lot of the sort of felled wood in the project is to, do the work of the live trees and live vegetation that isn't there yet. In a valley bottom that is, pretty much willow, there's no large diameter trees in most of the Pahsimeroi Valley, with some exception. What would you recommend there? Do you have some ideas? Have you put some thought into what you would do?
Yeah. So honestly, just looking at the landscape and the vegetation and the surfaces, I wouldn't expect that place to have large wood other than, like you say, the cottonwoods. Got to give you some background, one step back. I think another element that we need to add to this that we haven't talked about today in this workshop, but that's the biology and the plants. So classic, stream restoration, and when we talk about flow and sediments, we're really talking about physical processes, flow, whatever discharges we're looking at, sediment routing, plan forms, and how those route sediments and stuff. Colin Thorne and Janine Castro put out a paper a couple years ago where they added a third leg to that, and we're really talking about biology and what you see in my screen grab right here, how living trees, dead trees, beavers, even the macroinvertebrates, those all become more important in shaping the future of this valley than the physical processes do. So as far as planting and how do you get that roughness on there, yeah, you could short-term put some roughness elements on the surface if you think that your velocities are going to be so great that the valley is going to unravel. I've never seen one that does. We've got several videos of these valleys under big floods. It's like Kate showed you, it's a lake. It's just standing dead water. The energy's gone. So really it's just about letting letting it build itself from that point forward. Let the vegetation and whatever's going to colonize that site, assume, you know, as long as it's going to be native materials and not reed canary grass, let it dictate its own future. Let it build itself.
Yeah, Paul, and this is Kate. I'll just add that, you know, we obviously put a ton of wood in the South Fork. It looks insane. And it's not that we think that the natural condition is to have that much wood everywhere, but that it's acting as a proxy until those islands and that native vegetation regrowth occurs. That we needed that roughness element in there, because it is a slightly higher gradient system, and obviously in a heavily forested area where large wood is an important component. But it is a proxy until those roughness elements to form on their own.
I'll add though, on top of what Kate said, and this never occurred to me until we brought in Ryan Belmore from the Pacific Northwest Research Station. He's looking at food web mosaics, and that wood and everything that's on this landscape, it's another medium that grows different macroinvertebrates, and terrestrial stuff walks across those and falls in. So it does add quite a bit to the food complexity as well. It never occurred to me until you pointed it out.
Thank you.
We've got some questions on using the GGL, and if there's a set of instructions, or if you have a paper available, Paul or Kate, on how to use that for someone that has just a basic background in GIS.
Yeah, so we do have a paper out. It doesn't really explain, you know, the step-by-step, you know, how to run it and how to interpret it probably is the bigger problem. You know, we do a lot of screen shares with folks that are working it up for themselves, and usually it's the interpretation of, you know, so what's it all mean when you bring it together, where unless you've done 400 of these, you know, those nuanced things might not jump out to you. But anyway, long story short, yes, there is a paper. There's also Matt's built the tool, and he's put that on GitHub, so you can download it for free and run it in GIS. A lot of folks are trying to run it in AutoCAD now as well. So however works for you, there's different ways of getting there.
Okay, and then another great question came up about working in local floodplain counties and working with FEMA and rising your base flood elevation. Can you speak to any of the work that has been completed where a special flood hazard area has been mapped? And is the letter of map amendment process unavoidable?
I think Kate can probably speak to this one best. She's going through that process right now.
Well, actually, Johan might have a better answer, but for the Finrock Reach project that I shared briefly, we do have private land adjacent to that and the highway, and so we had to show no rise for that project. And because we had to do that, it actually modified our cut zones. We actually had to expand our cut zones to show no net rise. So it is possible, but it does kind of tweak your design a little bit. And maybe Johan can talk about the more of the FEMA stuff.
Yeah, not too much more to add. I think in Oregon, FEMA has instructed our counties. For a while there, the counties seemed like they had the fear of God put in them and were very concerned about any kind of rise. But FEMA clarified with our counties that no, this is not about restoration. This is about infrastructure. And if there's no infrastructure on federal lands where you're working, and you know, you can do this project for a restoration purpose, we're not, this doesn't apply whatsoever, which was quite a relief to us that they instructed the counties that way. Kate,
did you get that in writing, and can you share that? Was that a response in writing that if it's a restoration project, then it's not required? Because that would be pretty useful in Idaho here too.
Yeah, someone was just asking me for that letter the other day, and I was having trouble locating it, but I will get that. It's very Oregon specific, but It essentially was direction saying, look, on a restoration, particularly on federal lands, don't hassle these folks. It's not in our jurisdiction to do that. The project that Kate's working on, Finn Rock, that's definitely, it's a land trust land, it's a private land. And so they hired a consultant to do the flow modeling, and it was a much bigger concern. And the county really wants to see that zero rise. But yeah, even, and what's interesting is that we're at a stage 8 in that design that Kate's doing, which means we're lower, but we still have to show through modeling that we're not increasing. So I would say the jury's not out yet on private lands. We're still kind of working through that, and we'll see how it comes out with Finn Rock. But on fed lands, we've been told this is for restoration purposes, and don't hassle the feds.
That's great. I've seen it for anadromous fish habitat, but for those people dealing with resident fish habitat, I've seen it be an issue more so.
I wanted to tack on one thing real quick, if I could, on the flood hazard analysis. And that was that photo I showed you of the UK scene. So that was the first one. Johan and I were over there 2 years ago, I think, and helped them get that going. And restoration in the UK is all about climate change preparedness. And, you know, they have flashy flows and villages built on the streams. So flood attenuation is everything. And so after building this project, even though it's a tiny little thing, it has caught fire over there. And they're currently evaluating the entire country for every possible opportunity to do this for the purpose of flood attenuation. So kind of a neat side effect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if you'll recall the last image I showed from the hydraulic modeling results from the White Juice example, and keep in mind that's a relatively confined floodplain between basalt canyon walls that are only about 300 feet apart. The 100-year flow has the exact same wetted footprint in the pre and post project.
There's one last good question up here before we go into Brian. What about for the local boating and recreational community? Has there been resistance or pushback from boaters on this sort of approach?
That's a Kate question.
That was a pretty funny one.
Yeah.
So survey crew.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the South Fork, Mackenzie River, that was a river that was boated by a handful of people and even commercially guided by a couple outfits. And so early on, we worked with those folks and basically got their buy off on giving up their boating access to maximize fish productivity and restoration of fluvial processes. So it took a while. It took field trips and presentations, and but eventually they were all on board. So that was pretty exciting. Yeah. So, and Paul mentioned ODFW. They had, you know, we've been documenting Chinook reds for decades in that reach, and they counted those reds via kayaks. And now that we totally screwed that up for them, they're basically like, all right, you guys are doing the red counts in the project area now. They refuse to go in there and do that.
So Kate's missing part of that story. The people doing the red surveys weren't aware, apparently, and they showed up and quit on the site. So they could not paddle through it.
So I will add on the Finn Rock Reach project that is kind of a floodplain adjacent to the Mackenzie River. The Mackenzie River is a huge boating river. There's no way we could ever get buy off in limiting boating on that river. So it is a unique design to try to maintain passage in that main stem, but because we're doing stage 8 at a lower base elevation, we can reconnect that floodplain and add a bunch of roughness. And the main stem Mackenzie is still the most efficient route and will remain the most efficient route. And so we can maintain boating that way. it does give the project area a risk of deposition and cutting off some channels that enter that floodplain zone, which is why we made it such a large area. So you have multiple surfaces and channels entering that zone, assuming that some of those will aggregate and shut off and over time and kind of change over time. So that's kind of how we thought through that issue.